There are some houses that hold secrets so dark they seep into the very walls, staining the wood, poisoning the air, whispering through the halls long after the living have gone. The Bellamy estate was one such place. It stood grand and imposing on a hill overlooking the Mississippi River, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun like polished bone. Magnolia trees lined the gravel drive, their heavy blossoms perfuming the air with a sweetness that almost masked the rot beneath. Inside that house lived two sisters, Margaret and Catherine Bellamy. Margaret was the elder by 4 years, a woman of 30 with sharp features and sharper eyes. She had inherited the plantation upon their father's death, along with the 63 souls who worked its fields and served its halls. She wore her authority like a second skin, moving through the house with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. Catherine, at 26, was softer in appearance. Honey-colored hair where Margaret's was dark, rounder cheeks, a quicker smile. But those who knew her well understood that softness was deceiving. Catherine's desires ran deep and strange, currents beneath still water. The sisters had always been close, perhaps too close. After their father's passing and their mother's retreat into laudanum and silence, Margaret and Catherine had become a world unto themselves. They took their meals together, rode together in the mornings, spent their evenings in the parlor with needlework and wine. They shared everything, including Sarah. Sarah had come to the Bellamy plantation 3 years earlier, purchased at auction in New Orleans. She was 17 then, with skin the color of warm amber and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow even in their youth. Her mother had been sold away when Sarah was 12. Her father, she never knew. Margaret had bought her for Catherine's birthday, a gift, she said, a companion for her sister's lonely hours. But the nature of that companionship was something whispered about in the quarters, something the other enslaved people averted their eyes from, something that made old Aunt Bess shake her head and mutter prayers. Sarah slept in a small room off Catherine's chamber. She dressed Catherine in the mornings, braided her hair, read to her in the afternoons. At night, she did not return to the quarters with the others. Margaret did not seem to mind. In fact, she encouraged it. "She keeps Catherine content," Margaret would say to visitors who noticed the unusual arrangement, "and a content sister is a peaceful household." What she didn't say was that she, too, had claim to Sarah's time. That some nights it was Margaret's door that opened, Margaret's voice that called softly down the hallway. The arrangement was unspoken, but understood. Sarah belonged to both sisters, passed between them like a book or a shawl, an object of shared possession. For 3 years, this terrible equilibrium held. Until Catherine began to change. It started subtly. Catherine began requesting Sarah's presence more frequently, keeping her close during the day, insisting she sleep in her room every night. She brought Sarah small gifts, a ribbon, a piece of hard candy, a worn book of poetry. She taught Sarah to read better, to write her name. She looked at Sarah not with the cold ownership of a mistress, but with something far more dangerous, tenderness. Margaret noticed. At first, she said nothing. She watched as Catherine fussed over Sarah's appearance, as she laughed at something Sarah whispered, as her hand lingered too long on Sarah's arm. Then came the afternoon Margaret entered the parlor unannounced and found Catherine weeping, her head in Sarah's lap, Sarah's fingers gently stroking her hair. They both froze when they saw her. "She was upset," Sarah said quietly, her eyes downcast. "I was only—" "Leave us," Margaret said, her voice like ice. Sarah fled. When the door closed, Margaret turned to her sister. "You're becoming attached." Catherine's face flushed. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Margaret moved closer, her skirts rustling. "She is property, Catherine, a tool for our comfort, nothing more." "She's a person," Catherine whispered, and even as the words left her mouth, she seemed surprised by them. Margaret's expression hardened. She is what I say she is, what we say she is, and if you've forgotten that, perhaps the arrangement needs to change. What do you mean? I mean, Margaret said slowly, deliberately, that if you cannot maintain proper perspective, then perhaps Sarah should be sold. There's a trader coming through next month. She'd fetch a good price. Catherine's face went white. You wouldn't. I will, unless you remember your place and hers.
For a moment, something flickered in Catherine's eyes, defiance, perhaps, or rage. But it died as quickly as it came, smothered by years of deference to her older sister. "I understand," Catherine said quietly. But she didn't. Not really. Because that night, alone in her room with Sarah braiding her hair before the mirror, Catherine made a decision that would damn them all. "If I could," Catherine whispered, so softly Sarah almost didn't hear, "I would take you away from here, somewhere she couldn't reach us." Sarah's hands stilled. "Miss Catherine." "I know it's impossible," Catherine continued, her eyes meeting Sarah's in the mirror. "But if there were a way." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Sarah said nothing. What could she say? Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But in the weeks that followed, Catherine's words echoed in the space between them, a dangerous seed taking root. Margaret watched her sister with growing suspicion. She noticed the way Catherine's eyes followed Sarah across a room, the way she invented reasons to keep Sarah near, the way she became sullen and withdrawn whenever Margaret exercised her own claim to Sarah's time. The balance had shifted, and Margaret would not tolerate it. She began to test Catherine's attachment, calling for Sarah at odd hours, keeping her occupied with tasks that prevented her from attending to Catherine. She assigned Sarah to work in the fields for a week, watching Catherine's distress with cold satisfaction. When Catherine protested, Margaret smiled. "She's becoming spoiled with indoor work," Margaret said. "A little labor will remind her of her place." Catherine bit her lip until it bled, but said nothing. Sarah returned from the fields with blistered hands and sunburned shoulders. That night, Catherine wept as she applied salve to Sarah's wounds, whispering apologies. "It's not your fault, Miss Catherine," said, though they both knew it was, and wasn't. "I'll find a way," Catherine whispered. "I swear it." But how? She had no money of her own, no legal authority. Everything belonged to Margaret. Even Sarah. Especially Sarah. The tension in the house grew thick as summer heat. The other enslaved people felt it, moving carefully through their duties, avoiding eye contact. Old Aunt Bess muttered her prayers louder, burning sage in her cabin at night. "Something wicked coming," she told the others. "Can feel it in my bones. That house is cursed." She wasn't wrong. It was late August when Margaret made her decision. She was in her study, reviewing the plantation's accounts, when the trader's letter arrived. He would be passing through Vicksburg in 3 weeks, looking to purchase prime stock for the New Orleans market. Margaret set down her pen and stared out the window, where she could see Catherine and Sarah walking in the garden below, their heads close together. Too close. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. "Dear Mr. Thornton, I have a girl who may interest you." She didn't tell Catherine. Not yet. Instead, she watched and waited, gathering evidence of her sister's transgression. For that's what it had become in Margaret's mind. Catherine had broken their unspoken agreement. She had developed feelings, complicated their simple arrangement with sentiment and foolishness. Such things could not be allowed. 2 weeks passed. Margaret grew colder, more distant. Catherine grew more desperate, her attachment to Sarah now obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Then came the night everything changed. Margaret had been dining with neighbors, a tedious evening of plantation gossip and political talk. She returned home near midnight, tired and irritable, wanting only her bed. But as she climbed the stairs, she heard it. Soft laughter from Catherine's room. She paused, her hand on the banister. More laughter. Then Catherine's voice, warm and affectionate, in a way Margaret had never heard directed at her. Something hot and poisonous bloomed in Margaret's chest. Not quite jealousy, not quite rage, but something containing elements of both. She moved down the hallway silently, stopping outside Catherine's door. Inside, she could hear Catherine reading aloud, Sarah's occasional quiet responses. The intimacy of it was undeniable. Margaret's jaw tightened. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. No, not yet. She had a better idea. The next morning, Margaret summoned Sarah to her study. "Close the door," she said when Sarah entered. Sarah obeyed, standing with her eyes downcast, hands folded. Margaret studied her for a long moment. She was beautiful, Margaret acknowledged, more so than when she'd first arrived. Catherine's care had added a glow to her skin, a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before.
"My sister has become too fond of you," Margaret said finally. Sarah said nothing. "You've encouraged it." "No, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "I've done only what was asked of me." "Have you?" Margaret rose from her desk, circling Sarah slowly. "Or have you perhaps taken advantage of my sister's gentle nature, used your position to gain favor? I would never—" "Silence." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "I've decided you're to be sold. There's a trader coming next week. You'll fetch a good price in New Orleans, I'm told. Pretty girls like you always do." Sarah's intake of breath was the only sign of her fear. "You will say nothing of this to Catherine," Margaret continued. "When the time comes, you'll be gone before she wakes. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. You're dismissed." Sarah turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ma'am?" "What? Will you tell Miss Catherine where I've gone?" Margaret smiled, cold and sharp. "That's no concern of yours." Sarah nodded and left, her composure held together by the thinnest of threads. But Margaret had miscalculated, because Sarah did tell Catherine, not in words, but in the way she held her that night, memorizing the shape of Catherine's hand in hers, the sound of her breathing. Catherine felt it, the unspoken goodbye in every gesture. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, catching Sarah's wrist as she turned to leave. "Tell me." "I can't, Miss Catherine. Tell me." And so Sarah did. Catherine sat frozen on her bed, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. "Sold. Next week. New Orleans." "No," Catherine whispered. Then louder, "No." She stood, pacing the room like a caged animal, her mind racing. A week. She had 1 week. "There must be something I can do," she said, more to herself than to Sarah. "I could speak to Margaret, reason with her." "Miss Catherine," Sarah said gently, "you know your sister's mind is set." "Then I'll—" Catherine's voice trailed off. "What? Buy Sarah herself? She had no money. Run away? Where would they go? Who would help them?" The impossibility of their situation closed in like walls. Catherine sank back onto the bed, her face in her hands. Sarah knelt before her, taking Catherine's hands in her own, a gesture far too familiar, too tender for slave and mistress. "I knew this day would come," Sarah said softly. "Nothing good was ever going to come of this. Don't say that. It's true. Your sister was right about one thing. I am property. I always will be. And you?" Sarah's voice caught. "You deserve a life not ruined by caring for someone you can't have." Catherine looked up, her eyes red. "What if I don't want that life?" They stared at each other in the candlelight, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down upon them. Then, "We're both fools," Sarah whispered. The next days passed in agony. Catherine barely ate, barely spoke. She spent every possible moment with Sarah, knowing each could be their last. Margaret watched this with grim satisfaction, certain she had made the right choice. Her sister would grieve, Yes, but she would recover. Sentiment was a disease that time could cure. She was wrong. Because on the fifth night, Catherine came to Margaret's study with a wild look in her eyes. "I'll do anything," Catherine said. "Name your price, but don't sell her." Margaret set down her pen. "Catherine, anything, Margaret. I'll never speak to her again. I'll send her to the fields permanently. I'll—" "Stop this." Margaret's voice was sharp. "You're humiliating yourself. I don't care." "Well, you should." Margaret stood, her face flushed. "Do you not understand what you've done, what you've become? You've developed an attachment, Catherine, an unnatural, inappropriate attachment to a slave. It's obscene. I love her." The words dropped into the room like stones into water, rippling outward into heavy silence. Margaret stared at her sister, shocked into speechlessness. Catherine began to laugh, a broken, desperate sound. "There, I've said it. I love her. And you can punish me however you like, but don't punish her for it. Please, Margaret. She's done nothing wrong." Margaret's shock hardened into cold fury. "Get out, Margaret. Margaret, get out of my sight before I have you locked in your room like the mad woman you've become." Catherine fled, leaving Margaret alone with her rage. That night, Margaret made a new decision. Selling Sarah was too merciful, too clean. If Catherine wanted to destroy herself over this girl, then she would learn a far harsher lesson. Margaret called for Jacob, the overseer, a brutal man who had worked the plantation for 5 years, feared by all. "There's a girl in the house causing trouble," Margaret told him. "Tomorrow morning, I want her taken to the punishment shed. 20 lashes should remind her of her place."
Jacob's eyes glittered. "The pretty one? Miss Catherine's girl? That's the one. And Jacob, make sure my sister watches." The next morning dawned gray and cold. Catherine woke to find Margaret in her room, her face set like stone. "Get dressed," Margaret said. "There's something you need to see." Catherine's blood went cold. "What have you done?" Teaching a lesson that should have been taught long ago. Catherine tried to run, but Margaret caught her arm, her grip like iron. 2 house servants appeared at the door. Margaret had planned for this, and together they half dragged, half carried Catherine outside. The other enslaved people had been assembled in the yard, forced to bear witness. And there, tied to the whipping post, her back bare, was Sarah. "No!" Catherine screamed, fighting against the hands that held her. "Margaret, stop this, please!" Margaret watched, unmoved. "This is your doing, sister. Remember that." Jacob raised the whip. "Stop!" The voice wasn't Catherine's. It was Sarah's. She had turned her head, looking directly at Margaret with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient, knowing. "You think this ends with my blood?" Sarah said, her voice strange, deeper than before. "You think pain is the worst you can do to me?" "Quiet," Jacob snarled, but something in Sarah's gaze made him hesitate. "I've endured worse than you can imagine," Sarah continued, still staring at Margaret. "And I'll endure this too. But know this, Margaret Bellamy. Every drop of blood you spill today will water seeds you don't want to grow. The ground remembers. The dead remember." A chill ran through the assembled crowd at Sarah's words, spoken with an authority no enslaved person should possess. Margaret's face paled, but she steeled herself. "She's trying to frighten you. Proceed, Jacob." The first lash fell. Sarah didn't scream. The second struck, splitting skin. Still no sound from Sarah. But Catherine's screams filled the air, raw and broken. By the 5th lash, Catherine had collapsed, held upright only by the servants gripping her arms. By the 10th, her voice had given out to hoarse sobs. By the 20th, something in Catherine broke that would never be repaired. When it was done, Sarah hung limp against the post, her back a ruin of blood and torn flesh. Jacob cut her down, and she crumpled to the ground.
Catherine broke free of her captors and ran to Sarah, cradling her in her arms, blood soaking into her dress. "I'm sorry," Catherine wept. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's eyes opened, glazed with pain. "Not your fault." "Take her to my room," Catherine commanded the servants. "Now." Margaret stepped forward. "She goes to the quarters with the others." Catherine looked up at her sister, and Margaret actually stepped back at what she saw there. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder. "If you touch her again," Catherine said, her voice deadly quiet, "I will kill you." She meant it. They both knew it. Margaret relented, if only to avoid the scandal of what Catherine might actually do. Fine, 1 week. Then she sold, not negotiable. Catherine didn't respond, too focused on Sarah, who had lost consciousness. The week that followed was a nightmare of pain and fever. Sarah's wounds festered despite Catherine's constant care. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in voices that weren't hers, words and languages Catherine didn't recognize. Catherine never left her side, ignoring Margaret's increasingly angry demands. "You're killing yourself over a slave," Margaret hissed through the closed door. "She'll be gone in 3 days. Accept it." But Catherine couldn't, wouldn't. On the 3rd night, as Sarah's fever spiked dangerously, Catherine made a decision. She would get help, the only help available to her. In the quarters, old Aunt Bess was known more than just a healer. She knew the old ways, the practices brought from Africa and kept alive in whispered rituals. The masters forbade such things, but in the quarters, Bess was respected, feared even. Catherine crept out after midnight, making her way to Bess's cabin. The old woman was awake, as if expecting her. "I need your help," Catherine pleaded. "Sarah's dying, and I know why you're here, child," Bess said, her voice like dry leaves. "And I know what you want to ask, but that path leads nowhere good." "I don't care. Tell me what to do." Bess studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Some things ain't meant to be held on to. Some people, we love them, but we got to let them go." "No, the world won't let you keep her, Miss Catherine. You know this." "Then I'll change the world. Tell me how to save her." Bess shook her head. "I can give you medicines for the body, but what's killing that girl ain't just the wounds on her back. It's the wound in her soul." "Your sister broke something that can't be fixed with herbs and poultices." "Then what?" Catherine's voice broke. "I can't lose her." "Sometimes," Bess said softly, "love means letting go." But Catherine wasn't listening. She was desperate, drowning, willing to grasp at anything. "There must be something," she insisted. "Some way to bind her to me, to keep her here." Bess's eyes sharpened. "You talking about chains stronger than what she already wearing?" "No, I mean," Catherine struggled to explain, "a way to make sure we're never separated, that even if Margaret sells her, she'll find her way back to me." "You mean a binding?" Catherine nodded eagerly. Bess was quiet for a long time. Then, "There is a way, but it requires something of you both. Blood willingly given, words spoken under the new moon, and the understanding that once tied, you can't never be untied, not in this life or the next. I don't care. You should. Bindings like that, they go deep, deeper than death. You'll be connected forever, for good or ill. Then I'll do it." Bess searched Catherine's face and saw only desperate determination. She sighed again, heavier this time. "Come back tomorrow night," she said. "I'll prepare what's needed. But, Miss Catherine, you remember old Bess warns you. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed." Catherine nodded and hurried back to the house, hope kindling in her chest for the first time in days. She didn't see Margaret watching from the shadows of the main house, her face twisted with rage. Margaret had seen Catherine go to the quarters. She had followed, listened outside Bess's cabin, heard enough to understand what her sister planned. Witchcraft, hoodoo, unnatural practices. It was the final straw. Margaret returned to the house and sat in her study until dawn, her mind working. If Catherine wouldn't be reasoned with, if sentiment had poisoned her beyond recovery, then Margaret would have to be more direct. She thought of the old well on the property's eastern boundary, 40 feet deep, long abandoned, covered with rotting boards. She thought of accidents, of how easily they could happen, of how a slave girl, weakened by fever and wounds, might stumble in the night and fall. Such a tragedy, no one to blame. And if Catherine was distraught, well, grief was natural. She would recover in time, away from here. Perhaps Margaret would send her to their aunt in Charleston for a few months. Yes, that would solve everything. Margaret smiled to herself as the sun rose, her decision made. She didn't know that Sarah, lying in Catherine's bed miles away, had opened her eyes in the gray dawn light. "She's going to kill me," Sarah whispered. Catherine, dozing in a chair beside the bed, jerked awake. "What?" "Your sister. I saw it. In the fever dreams." Sarah's eyes were clear but haunted. "The old well. She means to drown me." "No, she wouldn't." "She would." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing. "Catherine, you have to let me go. Run before." "Never." "Please." "I said never." Catherine's voice was fierce. "Tomorrow night we'll do the binding Bess spoke of. You'll be tied to me forever. Margaret can't sell you, can't hurt you, because you'll always come back. Always." Sarah looked at Catherine's desperate face and felt something break inside her chest. "You don't understand what you're asking for," Sarah said quietly. "I understand I can't live without you. Even if it damns us both?" Catherine took Sarah's hand. Even then. The following night came too quickly. Catherine waited until the house was silent, then helped Sarah, still weak but determined, down the back stairs and across the dark grounds to the quarters. Bess was waiting in a small clearing behind her cabin, a fire burning low, casting dancing shadows across her weathered face. "You both sure about this?" Bess asked. "Yes," Catherine said immediately. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Then sit, across from each other, hands joined." They obeyed. The firelight played across their faces, Catherine's pale and tense, Sarah's drawn with pain but resolute. Bess began to chant in a language neither woman understood, moving around them in a slow circle. She stopped before them, producing a small knife. "This blade will cut you both," she said. "Your blood will mix. Your fates will intertwine. Do you accept this freely?" "Yes," they said together. Bess made a small cut across Catherine's palm, then Sarah's. She pressed their hands together, blood mingling. What is bound in blood cannot be unbound by death. What is joined in love cannot be separated by hate. What is tied in this world will remain tied in the next. So it is spoken, so it shall be. The air around them seemed to thicken, to pulse with something ancient and powerful. Catherine felt it into her, a warmth spreading from her joined hand with Sarah up her arm into her chest. Sarah gasped, feeling the same. For a moment, Catherine could feel what Sarah felt, the pain in her back, the exhaustion in her bones, the deep, abiding sorrow of her life. Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. And Sarah, for a heartbeat, felt Catherine's love, so fierce it was almost violent, so deep it had no bottom. And then the moment passed, and they were themselves again, but changed. "It's done," Bess said, stepping back. "God help you both." They returned to the house in silence, both exhausted.
Catherine helped Sarah back into bed, then collapsed in the chair beside her. "I can feel you," Catherine whispered, "even now, your heartbeat." "I know," Sarah replied.
I feel you too. They slept that way, hands still joined, not knowing it would be their last peaceful moment. Because Margaret had watched them leave, and Margaret had followed. She hadn't been close enough to hear the ritual, but she'd seen enough. The fire, the old woman, the clasped hands. Witchcraft, just as she'd suspected. It confirmed everything Margaret believed. Catherine had been corrupted, poisoned by this slave girl who had clearly bewitched her with dark practices. The binding made Margaret's plan even more necessary, even more urgent. If Catherine was truly bound to Sarah by some unholy ritual, then Sarah's death was the only way to break it, to free her sister from this curse. Margaret spent the pre-dawn hours making preparations. She told the household staff that Sarah had been sold early, that a trader had made an offer too good to refuse and would be collecting her that evening. She forged a bill of sale, complete with false trader's name. Then she visited Jacob. "Tonight," she told him, "you'll help me with a task. There's a problem that needs eliminating." Jacob understood the kind of problem she meant. The girl? Yes, make it look like an accident. The old well on the eastern boundary, a fall. And if Miss Catherine? Will be sedated. I'll see to it. She'll wake tomorrow with Sarah gone and a letter explaining she was sold. By the time she's clear-headed enough to question it, it will be too late. Jacob nodded slowly. He'd done worse for less reason. That evening, Margaret brought Catherine tea, special tea, laced with laudanum. "You look exhausted, sister," Margaret said, her voice gentle for the first time in weeks. "Drink this. It will help you sleep." Catherine, too tired to be suspicious, drank it. Within an hour, she was unconscious in her chair beside Sarah's bed. Margaret entered quietly, looking down at them both. For a moment, just a moment, something like regret flickered across her face. Then it hardened. She shook Sarah awake. "Get up," Margaret said coldly. "There's been a change of plans." Sarah, groggy and disoriented, saw Catherine slumped in the chair. "What did you do to her?" "She's sleeping, and you're coming with me, unless you want Jacob to wake her less gently." The threat was clear. Sarah rose on shaking legs, her back screaming in protest. Margaret led her outside, where Jacob waited with a lantern. They walked in silence across the dark grounds, Sarah stumbling, Margaret and Jacob on either side. When Sarah realized where they were headed, toward the abandoned eastern section of the property, true fear gripped her. "Where are we going?" she asked, though she already knew. Margaret didn't answer. They reached the old well, its mouth a black circle in the ground, the boards covering it rotted and broken. "Remove the boards," Margaret told Jacob. He obeyed, revealing the well's dark throat. Sarah tried to run, but Jacob caught her easily, his grip brutal on her injured back. She cried out. "Make it quick," Margaret said, turning away. "I don't want to hear it." Jacob dragged Sarah toward the well's edge. "Please," Sarah begged, "please, don't." "Should have thought of that before you bewitched Miss Catherine," Jacob growled. He shoved her. Sarah's scream echoed as she fell, cutting off abruptly when she hit the water 40 feet below. Margaret and Jacob stood at the edge, listening to the splashing, the struggle. Then silence. "Cover it," Margaret said. Jacob kicked the rotten boards back over the well's mouth, then piled stones on top for good measure. "No one knows this well exists but us, and it will stay that way." They walked back to the house, leaving Sarah's body in the cold, dark water below. What Margaret didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the binding Bess had performed was stronger than she'd imagined, and that death for those truly bound is not an ending. It's a transformation.
Catherine woke to agony. Not physical pain, something worse. A tearing sensation in her chest, as if part of her soul had been ripped away. She gasped, clutching her breast, and screamed, "Sarah!" No answer. Catherine stumbled from her chair, looking around wildly. The bed was empty. The room was empty. She ran into the hallway, still drugged and disoriented. "Sarah! Sarah!" Margaret emerged from her own room, a letter in hand. "Catherine, calm yourself." "Where is she? What have you done?" "The traitor came early," Margaret said, her face a mask of false sympathy. "I'm sorry. I know this is difficult, but she's been sold. Here's the bill of sale." Catherine snatched the paper, read it through blurring vision.
Then she crumpled it in her fist. "You're lying." "I'm not. I know you don't want to believe." "You're lying!" Catherine's voice was raw. "I can feel it. She's not sold. She's—" The truth crashed over her like ice water. "She's dead," Catherine whispered. "Oh, God, you killed her." "Don't be absurd." Catherine lunged at her sister, hands going for Margaret's throat. They crashed to the floor, Catherine screaming incoherently. It took 3 servants to pull them apart. "Lock her in her room," Margaret commanded, her own face scratched and bleeding. "She's hysterical. Send for the doctor." They dragged Catherine away, still screaming Sarah's name. For 3 days, Catherine was kept sedated, confined to her room. But even laudanum couldn't stop the dreams. She dreamed of water, cold water, darkness, drowning. She dreamed of Sarah's terror, felt it as if it were her own. Because of the binding, she had died with Sarah. Part of her had drowned in that well, and part of Sarah remained alive in her. On the 4th day, Catherine stopped screaming. She stopped fighting. The servants reported she sat quietly by her window, staring out at nothing. Margaret, relieved, believed her sister was finally accepting reality. She was wrong. Catherine was listening to a voice only she could hear, whispering from the place between life and death, where Sarah now dwelled. "The well," the voice said, "eastern boundary." That night, Catherine picked the lock on her door, a skill Sarah had taught her months ago, and slipped out of the house. She found the well by instinct, guided by the pull in her chest. She removed the stones, pulled away the boards, looked down into darkness. "I'm here," she whispered. "Tell me what to do." "Revenge," Sarah's voice echoed from below. "Justice. Make them pay." "Yes." Catherine returned to the house, moving like a ghost through its halls. She went to her father's study, to the locked cabinet where he'd kept his pistol. Another lock picked. The gun was cold and heavy in her hand. She found Margaret in her bed, sleeping peacefully. Catherine stood over her sister, the pistol aimed at her head. How easy it would be. One pull of the trigger. But Sarah's voice whispered, "No, too quick. She deserves to suffer as I suffered." Catherine lowered the gun. "What then?" she whispered. "Fire," Sarah said. "Let the house burn with her in it. Let her feel terror. Let her struggle. Let her fail." Catherine moved through the house, soaking curtains and carpets with lamp oil. She started the fires in 3 places: the parlor, the library, the kitchen. Then she returned to Margaret's room and locked the door from the outside. Only when she heard Margaret wake, screaming, pounding on the locked door, did Catherine leave. She walked calmly across the grounds as flames consumed the house behind her, her sister's screams fading into the roar of fire. The enslaved people ran from their quarters, not to save the house, but to save themselves, fearing they'd be blamed. Catherine walked to the old well. She sat on its edge, her feet dangling over the darkness. "I did it," she said to the dark water below, "for you." "Come down to me," Sarah's voice invited. "We're bound, remember, forever." Catherine looked back once at the burning house, then at the long drop below. She didn't hesitate. She jumped. The cold water embraced her like arms, like Sarah's arms. She didn't try to swim. She let the water fill her lungs. And in her last moment, she felt Sarah's presence surround her, complete her. They drowned together as they'd loved. Impossible, forbidden, eternal. The Bellamy plantation burned to the ground that night, Margaret inside it. Catherine's body was found in the well 3 days later, along with another, Sarah's, their hands somehow clasped together, despite the days between their deaths. The estate passed to distant relatives who sold it immediately. The land was cursed, everyone said, haunted. And they were right. Because on certain nights, people passing by the old well, now filled in but still visible as a depression in the earth, claimed to hear voices. 2 women, speaking softly to each other. Sometimes laughing. Always together. The binding, after all, was eternal. And some loves, some injustices, don't end with death. They transform. They endure. They haunt.